Thanks, Rod. Okay, I know we're a bit behind schedule, so I'll try and be quick. But yes, like Rod mentioned, this last year we had new regulations that were promulgated under Act 36. So I'll just give you some background on what that entails and what's new and what you can expect in future. Okay, so Act 36 is the act that governs our industry, or there's lots of acts that governs the industry, but the one that we register pesticides, it's Act 36 of 1947. It's also used for the regulation of farm feeds and fertilizers, but agricultural remedies fall under Act 36. Okay, so pest control operators also fall under Act 36. So, Act 36 is quite old. It was promulgated in 1947, and Jonathan likes to make a joke that even if a truck falls over on the highway and pesticides get spilled, it's often blamed on the act that's old. However, it doesn't make it redundant. The registrars also informed us that the act will be reviewed soon to bring it up to date with the Constitution. But we have to remember that under the Act, several regulations have been promulgated. So even though the Act is old, we have regulations coming out that keeps it current. So the newest regulations that were promulgated under the Act is the regulations relating to agricultural remedies, and that was promulgated last year in August in 2023. And it's specific to agricultural remedies that's regulated under the Act. Okay, so that begs the question, just so that we know to what it's applicable, is what is an agricultural remedy? So if we look at the definition from the Act, we can see it's any chemical substance or biological remedy or any mixture or combination of any substance intended or offered to be used for destruction, control, repelling, attraction, prevention. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially what it comes down to, it's not just chemical pesticides, it's also if you're using pheromone devices, biologicals, all of those types of products are classified as agricultural remedies, and that's why these regulations are applicable to all of these products. Okay, so the regulations have quite a bit of new things that we need to pay attention to. So I'm just going to touch on them briefly to give you background on what changed. Some of it has already been in the regulations with a few amendments, but we'll just quickly touch on it. Okay, so the first thing that we have in the regulations that's quite nice is we have administrative minor changes. I see my presentation is making the E separate, but anyway, so the definition of an administrative minor change in the regulations are applications essentially where the registration holder can inform the registrar of changes being made to the application, so it's really minor changes, but then they can make the changes to their applications or labels before waiting for approval from Act 36, which is a really nice thing because we know there's a backlog at Act 36 and they only have so much capacity, so making a change to, for example, a resistance statement or adding additional warnings, it's really nice that we can now do that in real time and not necessarily delay it for 2 years to get approval. Okay, so if the holder of an agricultural remedy registration notifies the registrar of an administrative minor change, then the registrar shall advise the registration holder approval has been granted. Okay, if we look at adverse reactions, which is also new, adverse reaction means an unintended or unexpected effect on animals, people, or the environment. And if we look at what it states in the regulation, is registration holders now have to report adverse effects to the registrar. So we have a template for that, and you have to do that anytime that something happens that's defined as an adverse reaction, and with your renewal of your remedy every 3 years, you also need to submit that information to the registrar so that they know if there's products with issues in the market, where we get lots of poisonings, for example, that they can make a decision during renewals whether it's still relevant to prove it. Okay, OECD GLP. So GLP is good laboratory practice. So we have GLP requirements for lots of the tests that we need to do to register a product. So I'm not going into too much detail, but essentially it's a system for making sure that you comply with specifics for laboratory tests, and it's quite stringent. I'm just going to go into a quick explanation. So essentially it's a quality control system, and it covers organizational processes and conditions under which non-clinical health and environmental studies are planned, performed, monitored, recorded. It's also audited, and the problem for industry in this regard is that it's a lot more expensive. However, OECD countries can share data, so they have the mutual acceptance of data principle, and that means studies conducted elsewhere in other OECD countries can usually use the same studies that were conducted internationally in their countries as well, to avoid duplication of studies. And as you can see, if you look on the OECD website, South Africa is full adherent to OECD and also complies to the mutual acceptance of data principle. So the quality of our laboratory studies needs to be improved, and it's going to be conducted going forward according to GLP. Okay, and then we have GHS, lots of acronyms. GHS, we've heard people mention it several times today. It's the globally harmonized system of classification, and that is the way in which we classify chemicals according to their hazards, and then also portray those hazards onto labels and safety data sheets. So just quick background. So this is the UN Globally Harmonized System of Classification book that we use to do the classification. And essentially it's an internationally harmonized approach to classification and labeling to ensure trade is easier and everyone using the same principles to classify remedies. So the GHS became mandatory for the classifying and labeling of hazardous chemicals with the promulgation of the regulations for hazardous chemical agents in March 2021. And then in 2023, when the regulations relating to agricultural remedies were promulgated, GHS was also included in the agricultural remedy regulations and became applicable to agricultural remedies. And we had a phase-in period, and currently labels should be updated according to GHS. We still expect a bit of a delay for all of the products in use to be updated according to GHS, but essentially going forward, most products would be GHS classified. Sorry, my presentation is doing weird things. Okay, so just to show you what it looks like, I'm not going to go into GHS in detail, but it is quite important. You've heard it several times. So our labels used to look like this. This was the WHO way of classification, and the most prominent thing is the yellow band at the bottom with the pictograms. So going forward, our labels would look more like this, and it will have pictograms, that's different. It wouldn't have color bands, and it would have hazard and precautionary statements on the front panel of the label. So the GHS is more comprehensive in the hazards that it communicates. For acute toxicity, it has all routes of exposure, where the WHO only took into account oral and dermal. We also have inhalation for GHS. And where WHO only took into account acute toxicity, we also now look at chronic hazards, physical and environmental hazards on the label. So it's important to remember that the hazards of the chemical didn't change, but the way in which we communicated did, and the hazards are just more comprehensive now. So we use pictograms, signal word, hazard statements, and precautionary statements on the GHS label, and no longer color bands. Okay, another new thing in the regulations, which is a quite nice addition, is a low-risk agricultural remedy. So the way in which it's defined, we have to look at Annexure A in the regulations, which we'll look at now. But essentially, with these remedies, the registrar may, within a reasonable period of time, expedite the review of the application of a low-risk agricultural remedy. So that means the registrar can essentially fast-track the registration of low-risk remedies. So if we just have a quick look of what that entails. So it's active substances without significant hazardous properties identified, active substances for which it's not possible to differentiate between the exposure associated with its use as an agricultural remedy, with its environmental relevant exposure levels or other uses in the food chain, active substances for which no consumer exposure linked to the mode of application is foreseen, and microorganisms that are not of human or animal health concern. Another change is minor use registration. So a minor use is essentially a use for agriculture, and it's for minor crops or minor uses in major crops. And essentially, the registrar may also expedite the review of these remedies. So if a grower association, for example, has an issue and they need a remedy to be approved for a minor use, there are certain ways in which to do it and certain data requirements that you need to submit, and then the registrar may fast-track that registration. Okay, then we also have a new category of agricultural remedies that's called restricted agricultural remedies. And I won't make eye contact with Eloani because she's waiting for me to send her a proposal. But essentially, the restricted agricultural remedies are agricultural remedies for which the registrar, out of concern for its human health or environmental risk, has set out additional information to be shown on the label concerning essential conditions in respect of the display, distribution or limitation on use, or qualifications of persons who may use the agricultural remedy, and it's also defined further in Annexure A. So essentially, the registrar can impose specific restrictions on these remedies, and our labels have to clearly state that it's restricted agricultural remedies. So if we look at what is a restricted agricultural remedy, it's class 1A and 1B of the WHO, categories 1 and 2 for acute toxicity of the GHS, agricultural remedies that's listed in Annex 3 of the Rotterdam Convention, and then agricultural remedy ingredients that have shown a high incidence of severe or irreversible adverse effects on human health or the environment. So essentially, it's acutely toxic remedies, and those going forward will have more severe restrictions than other remedies. Okay, then we have a requirement of SACNASP, and this is the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions Act, And essentially, in the regulation text, several of our studies that we need to conduct now needs to be signed off by someone that is registered as a professional scientist under the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions Act. Okay, then you will hear further today about the Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme, but essentially, I think this is dear mekaar, but anyway. So we have a requirement for all registration holders to belong to an Extended Producer Responsibility Scheme, where essentially you've heard CropLife is registered as a PRO, which is a producer responsibility organization to get rid of obsolete pesticides and also recycle pesticide packaging. And registration holders will now, going forward, have to show that they are compliant with this regulation when they do a registration or a renewal of their registration. Sorry, my slides are a bit dear mekaar for some reason. But anyway, we covered that. Okay, and then substances of concern. We will talk about that a bit later as well, because I think it is quite a contentious subject in the industry. So essentially, substances of concern are defined as having inherent capacity to cause an adverse effect on humans, animals, or the environment. And it's also further defined in Annex A of the regulations. So if we look at Annex A, it's agricultural remedy, active ingredients, and their formulations that meet the criteria of carcinogenicity, categories 1A or 1B of the GHS, and then also mutagenicity, categories 1A, 1B of the GHS, also reproductive toxicity, categories 1A or 1B of the GHS, agricultural remedy, active ingredients listed in the Stockholm Convention, except for DDT, that is used for malaria vector control by the Department of Health, and then agricultural remedies listed in the Montreal Protocol. So if we look at what the regulations require, is the registrar essentially cannot renew or register an agricultural remedy containing a substance of concern from 1 June 2024. And the nice clause that goes with it, though, is there's also prioritization of suitable alternative products. So the registrar may also prioritize the registration of suitable alternative products for some of these products that we will be losing off the market. So if we look at substances of concern, the regulations also provide us opportunity to apply for derogations so that we can keep agricultural remedies that fall within this classification for certain instances. So the instances that is applicable is the following: the risk to humans, animals, or the environment from exposure to the active substance in an agricultural remedy under realistic worst-case conditions of use is negligible. There's evidence that the active substance is essential to prevent or control a serious danger to human health, animal health, or the environment. Not approving the active substance would have a disproportionate negative impact on society when compared with the risk to human health, animal health, or the environment arising from the use of the substance. So in those instances, approval of the agricultural remedy may be granted for a specified period and for restricted uses following publication of the risk assessment reports for public comment by the applicant. So I'm not going to delve into detail about substance of concern because we'll talk about that later. And then I just mentioned a few additional requirements that's also in the regulations that we won't go into too much detail. In case of aerial application, if you want to apply to include the use of aerial application on your label, you will need to do a risk assessment to demonstrate clear advantages in terms of reduced impacts on human health and the environment. We also need to take into consideration the effect of exposure on children going forward for agricultural remedies. We also have to collect data on the effect on bees and other pollinators generated under the supervision of a person registered with SACNAS. Sorry. And then we have the reporting of potentially harmful or unacceptable effects. So the active ingredient, if it no longer complies with the standards, when you submitted it, you need to inform the registrar. If information comes to light that the remedy contains a substance of concern or agricultural remedy banned in the Republic of South Africa, you need to inform the registrar. If the agricultural remedy residues are no longer in accordance with the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act. Okay, and then advertisements, access to information and reporting of sales information. So for advertisement, a change that we've seen in the new regulations is the minimum requirements are stipulated in the regulations to which your advertisements should conform to. However, you no longer need to submit it to Act 36 for approval before publishing it. Access to information, so the registrar shall provide a quarterly updated list of registered agricultural remedies. So up until now, we've not had a public list of agricultural remedies registered in South Africa, so that has also become mandatory in the new regulations. And then reporting of sales information, so all registration holders need to provide to the registrar sales information for all the pesticides sold in the Republic of South Africa. Okay, and then after the regulations are promulgated, there has been several minor amendments that's been proposed just to clear up some ambiguity and provide clarity. So although the spirit of the law cannot be changed, we do expect some minor changes to be made in future to these regulations. And currently, some details of these new regulations are still being clarified in guidelines and templates composed by the industry working groups in collaboration with Act 36. Thank you. That is my summary of the new regulations. And if you ever have any questions on regulatory, you're welcome to contact me or our new regulatory specialist at CropLife, Anishka. I've included both of our contact details there. Thank you.